The defense of Pokrovsk has been breached. The days of Great Novoselivka are numbered, and the defense is falling apart. Good afternoon, dear friends. As always, we are here in our daily format to analyze the situation on the front lines. We open maps, study advances or retreats, and draw conclusions about how various events impact the overall situation on the front. Before we begin, I would sincerely like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Your subscription helps support its growth. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed. Yesterday was a tough day for the armed forces of Ukraine, bringing a string of bad news as the front began to crumble in several places. Over the course of just one day, the Russian army managed to take control of several settlements, some of which are key to further defense efforts. For instance, Novoselivka, where the last defensive line was breached yesterday by Russian forces. As a result, there are now no more defensive lines between this point and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. We'll discuss this in detail today. Let's move straight to the situation on the front and take a look at the map. As I mentioned, the AFU front has started to collapse in multiple areas. While this does not mean the entire front has fallen, yesterday's developments, which continue today, indicate serious problems for the Ukrainian forces. Let's go through everything step by step. We'll start with the Pokrovsk direction. You might recall that yesterday we discussed how Russian forces advanced not only along the flanks of Pishcheny, but also within the village itself. I mentioned that if the AFU lost the battle for the industrial zone, it would be tantamount to losing the entire settlement. And that is exactly what happened. Those familiar with frontline dynamics understand that industrial zones are typically fortified areas where defenses can be maintained for an extended period. Think of Azovstal, Avdiivka coke plant, or Krasnohorivka, and even now Kurakove. But here, everything ended in just one day. By the evening of the day before yesterday, Russian forces had reached the industrial zone, and by yesterday evening, Ukrainian troops were pushed out. Mine number 3 fell under Russian control, but the AFU's problems didn't stop there. They only intensified. With the loss of the industrial zone, they also lost control of the northern part of the village and were forced to retreat to the nearby heights. While the AFU now holds those heights, the critical issue is that Russian forces continued their advance in this area. They pushed Ukrainian troops out of the village of Volkov and advanced another kilometer towards Kotlina. Recently, we discussed what this could ultimately lead to. First, it allows Russian forces to move towards Zverov, threatening the rear of the Ukrainian defenses in Pokrovsk. Second, it paves the way for a swift advance towards the village of Hryshin, leading to the loss of the Dnipropetrovsk-Pokrovsk highway. This would nearly seal the fate of the AFU garrison in Pokrovsk, as 70% of their supplies rely on this route. But the AFU faced more challenges yesterday in other sectors, not just here. Let's move southward to another problematic area for the Ukrainian forces, where the situation is dire. Let me explain why. Again, I mentioned yesterday that this area represents the AFU's last defensive line in this sector, the Novoselivka line. Theoretically, they should defend this area fiercely, with no easy retreat. However, things took a dramatic turn. By midday yesterday, Russian forces had reached the center of the village and even raised a flag there. By evening, reports emerged that the AFU had been pushed out of Novoselivka. Additionally, Russian forces are advancing in the area between Novoselivka and Uspenivka. As I've said before, this will eventually lead to Russian troops being just 2 small villages away from Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, Nadezhdinka and Kotlyarivka. Nadezhdinka had a pre-war population of 300, and Kotlyarivka less than 100. That's all that stands in the way. Given the current pace of the offensive, it's expected that the Russian army could enter Dnipropetrovsk Oblast as early as January. Moreover, in this same area, the Russian army ousted the AFU from Shevchenko. While full control cannot yet be confirmed, there are credible reports that Ukrainian troops were forced out yesterday. Additionally, fighting has begun in Petropavlivka. There were also reports yesterday claiming the AFU abandoned the industrial zone in Kurakove. But these remain unconfirmed, as Ukrainian forces still maintain positions in the western part of Kurakove. However, Russian units were confirmed to have advanced along the northern bank of the Chiv Yar River. from the Dalia-Uspenivka road towards Yantane. The advance here was significant, covering 3 kilometers in just one day. Intense fighting also took place throughout the day yesterday in Chiv Yar. The situation there is as follows. Battles in Chiv Yar and surrounding areas. The battles for the workshops of the refractory plant in the center of Chiv Yar did not result in success for the Russian army, at least not entirely. While Russian assault units managed to temporarily push AFU troops out, holding the position and consolidating their success proved impossible. Following this, Russian command decided to adopt a different tactic. From the north, Russian units entered the Severnaya district, where intense fighting continued for nearly a month. Yesterday, AFU forces were driven out of the district. Additionally, battles began yesterday for the railway station. By evening, reports emerged that Ukrainian forces had been pushed out of the station's territory. The likely objective of these maneuvers is a broader encirclement of Chiv Yar from the north to cut off supply routes to the central parts of the city. These areas, which are the most fortified, cannot be taken head-on by Russian forces, as direct assaults have been ongoing since March or April without success, and soon it will have been a year. Seversk area, a rare Ukrainian counterattack. The only sector where the AFU achieved success yesterday was near Seversk. Russian advances in this area have been rare, and the front line has remained largely static. However, yesterday, Ukrainian forces launched a counterattack, pushing Russian positions 2 kilometers eastward toward Zolotarivka. This advance, marked in blue on the map, stands out as a success for the AFU in an otherwise stagnant front. It's worth noting that a recent rotation of Russian command in this area occurred after previous commanders were accused of falsifying reports of advances. Despite the change, renewed movement by Russian forces in this area has yet to materialize. Kursk Direction on December 29th. AFU counterattack in Kruglenka. Yesterday, Ukrainian forces managed to push Russian troops out of Kruglenka, which they had captured 5 days prior. The threat posed by Russian forces in this area was too significant for the AFU to ignore. Retreating south and leaving Maloloknya as their northernmost defensive line was not an option. Instead, Ukrainian command opted for a swift counterattack, driving Russian forces out of Kruglenka. Meanwhile, south of Sudzha, Russian forces completed their clearance of Cherkasskaya Konopelka. Fighting in this area has become increasingly static, with minimal dynamics, largely due to weather conditions, which are expected to improve in early January. This improvement could benefit both sides. Ukrainian forces, which have sufficient resources, could also exploit better weather for their own offensive. Poor weather in December likely prevented such actions, as forecasts of severe frost were not realized. Now, both sides are anticipating the cold with both hope and caution. Greater Novoselivka Direction on December 30th. Blockade and impending defeat of the AFU. For days, Russian drone units have been targeting anything that moves in both Velika Novoselivka and on the Path of Life, the supply route for the Ukrainian garrison running north along the western bank of the Mokry Yali River. The most intense fighting is taking place on the hill west of Vremivka. Russian forces aim to fully capture the hill, while Ukrainian troops desperately try to hold it. Losing this hill would completely seal the trap for the Ukrainian garrison in Velika Novoselivka, condemning it to swift destruction. The situation for the AFU is dire. Their equipment, particularly electronic warfare systems, is gradually being destroyed, leaving the garrison immobilized and unable to mount an organized defense. A direct assault in such a situation seems unnecessary, as Ukrainian forces are already suffering disproportionately high losses. Video footage from the settlement shows that many soldiers dream of retreating, but they are prevented not only by Russian drone operators, but also by their own command, which refuses to issue a withdrawal order and demands they hold their positions to the end, despite the increasingly untenable situation and unnecessary losses. Mirnoad Direction on December 30th, fighting in Vozdvizhenka. Let's tentatively call this the Mirnoad Direction, as there are no other major cities nearby. This discussion concerns battles east of Mirnoad. A few days ago, Russian forces conducted a successful reconnaissance-in-force operation, crossing the Kazhenyi Torets River and fortifying positions on its northern bank southeast of Mirnoad. Yesterday, Ukrainian sources reported another Russian attack farther east, in the area of Vozdvizhenka. Once again, Russian forces successfully seized advanced AFU positions, effectively driving Ukrainian troops out of the village. This front had remained static for months, but if we examine the map closely, these actions appear to be part of a unified tactical plan. The goal seems to be an encirclement of the Pokrovsk agglomeration from the east, with the initial stage involving cutting off the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway.